Have you ever thought about how African national teams would be better if the majority of their talented players didn't choose to represent other countries? Let's take a look at it. First, let me tell you something. Many African players move to Europe or America in search of a better life and career opportunities they don't find in their home countries. And it makes sense, right? The infrastructure, training, and visibility in European and American football are on another level. But this migration has a huge impact not just on these players' lives, but also on African football in general. Many players born in Africa end up naturalizing and playing for other national teams. This happens for several reasons. Many of them arrive in another country while still young and end up feeling more connected to the home where they grew up and developed as players. Plus, the chance to play for a more structured team with better chances of winning major tournaments is tempting. Here's an interesting example. The French team that won the World Cup in 2018, out of the 23 players, 13 were of African descent. Kylian Mbappé, for instance, has Cameroonian and Algerian roots, and Samuel Umtiti was born in Cameroon. These guys were crucial to France's victory. Then there's Mario Balotelli, who was born in Italy but is the son of Ghanaian parents. He could have played for Ghana, but chose Italy. Another example is N'Golo Kanté, who has Malian origins but plays for France. These players are living proof of how African talent has made a difference in European football. But what about the African teams? They lose incredible players, weakening the teams. And it's not just a matter of individual skill. These players bring experience and a winning mentality they acquire in major European clubs and national teams. You know who has talked about this? Jose Mourinho, one of the most famous coaches in the world. He said that African national teams could be much more competitive if players of African descent chose to represent their countries of birth. According to him, European football greatly benefits from this African talent, but that means African national teams miss the chance to strengthen themselves. Some players like Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah decided to represent their African national teams, Senegal and Egypt, respectively. This decision is not just about nationality, but also pride and identity. These players are examples of how commitment to their national teams can strengthen African football. And there's more. When these talented players choose to play for European teams, the global perception of African football is affected. It seems that African teams are less competitive, but that's not entirely true. If these players chose to play for their countries of origin, the story could be very different. I hope you don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these players can't or shouldn't seek better living conditions. I'm just pointing out that despite growing up in another country, these players could represent their country of origin. Of course, this decision is up to the player to make, but the point is about the gaps in African teams. And yes, all these players and the African people do deserve better resources for living. If someone thinks moving from Africa to another place would be better for them, they have every right. My point isn't about that. Imagine if these players could return to their African national teams with all the experience and skills they gained in top European clubs. They wouldn't just raise the technical level of the teams, but also inspire a whole new generation of local talent. It would be a huge transformation for African football, strengthening not just the national teams, but also local leagues and youth development structures. You know, this isn't a new issue. Look at football history and you'll find many cases like this. Zinedine Zidane, whose parents are Algerian, chose to represent the French national team, where he became one of the greatest stars in football history. Eusebio, born in Mozambique, also stood out by representing Portugal, leaving an impressive sports legacy. These players didn't just shine in their new teams, but also sparked important discussions about identity and patriotism in sports, influencing the development of football in their countries of origin. We all recognize the incredible impact African players have had on elite football leagues like the Premier League. Didier Drogba is a remarkable example of this, with his historic stint at Chelsea. He not only won major titles, but also became a global football icon, inspiring an entire generation of African players and raising the status of African football on the world stage. Besides Drogba, current stars continue to make their mark. Names like Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang from Gabon, who impressed at Arsenal with his ability to score decisive goals, demonstrate the significant contribution of African players to the success of European clubs. Wilfried Zaha from Ivory Coast is another standout African player in the Premier League, with his technical skills and speed, which were crucial for Crystal Palace. When talented players choose to play for European teams, it significantly affects the visibility of African football. These stars attract global attention to European tournaments and stop shining in African competitions. The Africa Cup of Nations, for example, loses a lot in terms of audience and international prestige. Think of famous players like Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi. How many times have you watched the game just to see them play, even if you weren't supporting their team or national team? The presence of established stars is a big draw for viewers, and the absence of these players in African national teams means many football fans around the world aren't as interested in the competition. Without renowned players to attract attention, the Africa Cup of Nations can't compete in terms of visibility with tournaments like the Euros, Copa America, or the World Cup, which are filled with famous players. This results in less media coverage, fewer sponsors, and less investment, directly affecting football development on the continent. Consequently, the absence of these stars reduces the interest of international scouts who could discover new talents during the tournament. Without the presence of standout players to attract scouts, the talent discovery system weakens, making it harder to identify and develop future football gems from Africa. This creates a vicious cycle where the lack of visibility leads to the loss of resources and opportunities, further hindering the growth of the sport on the continent. To wrap up, what I want to highlight is how African football has been affected, having issues with its development due to political and economic reasons. The problem isn't in the countries welcoming immigrants and refugees, or in the decision to leave one's country and even wear the jersey of another nation. My goal is to highlight how it holds back Africa in its football and regional tournaments, and I don't mean to criticize or devalue any player. After all, who hasn't been captivated by African football and the potential of its stars?